Hello, everybody. Welcome to our MEIC webinar, the IRP Revisited, Northwestern's Final Plan for Montana's Energy Future and the PSC's Review. I'm Katie Spence. I am the Communications and Engagement Director at MEIC, and I'm just going to kick us off here at the beginning. So first of all, what's the IRP? Why should you care about it? So the IRP is the Integrated Resource Plan. It is a 20-year plan that Northwestern Energy has to make every 3 years, and it's intended to plan out for the next 20 years of generation. And this is a really common kind of process for utilities around the country. It's an important way that they can keep up with changing prices, changing technologies, and have an iterative plan to try to find the best cost generation for electricity. The process has major implications for utility bills because Northwestern is planning what resources to invest in, and they're supposed to be doing a cost analysis and keep it affordable. But as many of us know, Northwestern's ultimate incentive is usually to make more money. And we've seen that reflected in the increasing rates over the past several years, which I think we have a slide for as well. And so this is a brand new graph that Nick put together in the last week or two. And as you can see, since Northwestern Energy has been raising rates, rates have increased 99%. And that's enormous. And so it's really important that we talk tonight about what's in this plan because as you can see, their planning process includes these rate increases. That's part of the plan that they keep getting approved at the PSC. So Nick is going to go into a lot of detail about that. But the process also has major implications for climate change. As always, Northwestern Energy is planning to invest heavily in fossil fuels, and they have tweaked some of the numbers to make that look more affordable than wind and solar. And again, Nick is going to go into that, but this is a really important place that we can speak up for our climate as well as our utility bills. And then interestingly, this is the first IRP in which Northwestern Energy is having to consider data centers and how to power those. That could be a huge driver in how they plan for the next 20 years of power generation. So before I turn it over to Nick and Shannon, who are much smarter and deeper in the weeds on this than I am, I did want to give a little bit of a public participation preview. There are ways that you can participate and speak up. So there is a comment period until July 28th. The email for that is on the screen, and I'll also put it in the chat while we're talking, and you can submit written comments. There will also be at least 2 public meetings where you can show up in person and talk to the PSC directly. Unfortunately, those haven't been announced yet, but as soon as we know, we'll let all of you know. And so tonight, while you're listening, I just wanted to give like maybe a little bit of a framework. If you've never given public comment before, or never submitted public comments before, I'm going to talk about how to do that at the end of our call. And in the meantime, just be listening for things that sound really relevant to you. Like, oh, is this going to make my bills go up? And how does that affect me? Make note of things that make you frustrated or angry. Those are really important things that we need to tell our elected officials. Like, these are decisions that you're making that are going to make my life harder or more expensive. And in general, what we'll talk about at the end of the call is also good for other public meetings. It'll be really applicable if you want to get involved in meetings at your county or in legislative sessions and other PSC meetings. So just wanted to give maybe a preview of what you can take away from our substantial portion here that Nick and Shannon are going to do, and then we'll talk more at the end about public participation. But now I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Katie, for that introduction and getting folks kind of in the mindset of the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan. So for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Nick Fitzmaurice. I'm the Energy Transition Engineer with MEIC, and I'm going to dive into some of the pieces of what's in Northwestern's IRP and also pass it off to Shannon James, also with MEIC, to talk a little bit about some of the details as well. I'm sure a number of folks have heard about the Integrated Resource Plan. We did a previous webinar back in, I believe it was in January of this year when Northwestern released its draft Integrated Resource Plan. And they've since filed what they're calling their final integrated resource plan at the Public Service Commission in April. So that's why we're revisiting this topic, to look at what has changed since the original draft, kind of revisit a lot of the issues that exist in the plan and get folks ready to engage at the Public Service Commission. Because as Katie said, that's going to be really important. So we're going to get into a little bit what's contained in the IRP. It's a really involved document. So this is kind of a crash course to give you an idea of what we're working with. And you're also welcome to find our resources online and elsewhere to get some more details. So largely the way that the IRP is laid out is NorthWestern has kind of looked at a number of different planning futures. They ran 18 different scenarios of what they might build over the next 20 years, given certain assumptions or things that they might come across. So we're not going to get into the details of all of those, but that's good to keep in mind. These on the screen are kind of the main high level different things. So there's a base case, which is effectively the standard, you might call it business as usual or something to that effect. And then all these other scenarios on top of that on might Colstrip retire early? Are there going to be different prices that we're facing for gas or electricity? What our data center is going to look like? That's a new part in this IRP. Whether or not we have limits on future carbon emitting resources, and what we're doing with the extra shares of the Colstrip plant that NorthWestern just bought, as well as these last two scenarios that one starts to look at transmission, but I'll mention later that it really doesn't capture the value of electric transmission in the way we need them to, as well as a scenario looking at increased demand side management and net energy metering. So from this vantage, it's actually, they set up what seems like a pretty reasonable set of planning futures. But the devil's in the details. And of course, it really matters how you set up a model for what results you're going to get. There's kind of countless assumptions, inputs, constraints, and even the goals that NorthWestern has established for their model to look for in the IRP. For example, what does it cost to build a wind versus a gas resource? How much of a given resource are you allowing to build? When can you build it? And what is the actual forecasted need into the future of resources? And something that I've heard quite a bit in the realm of modeling is this saying, garbage in, garbage out. If you have bad starting point for your model, you're not going to get quality results. So that's, I think, kind of a framework to keep in mind when looking at what's going on in the IRP. And for folks who have been following along, I'm going to go over some of the major issues that we've identified in the plan. And you'll notice that these are pretty much the same concerns that we had back in January. And I'm going to mention in a moment the things that have been tweaked since the original draft. But by and large, we have the same concerns with the final plan as we had with the draft. The first being that throughout the plan, wind and solar resources are undervalued to favor really expensive and damaging coal and gas and eventually nuclear energy. They do this through cost assumptions in a number of ways, as well as what they're assuming any given resource can contribute to their need. And there's a lot more information. We can go into that as well. The next thing is how much energy and specifically capacity NorthWestern is projecting they're going to need. So in 20 years, are they going to have the same amount of demand in Montana? Or are they going to have more, and how much more? And there's a number of ways where we're pretty sure they're projecting a bigger need than they need in reality. One of which, if you look back to NorthWestern's 2023 IRP, they've actually increased their base assumption for demand growth by 150 megawatts, which is pretty substantial. And this is actually before accounting for their data center modeling scenarios. So before we even get into data center growth, they're already kind of adding on more demand that doesn't seem to be coming from anywhere. And like I mentioned a little bit ago, they're not representing transmission the way they could be. And what that means is they're not showing how connection to other regions would reduce the amount of in-state generation they would need to build, which is a really important piece. And then third, they have continued to ignore climate change throughout the integrated resource plan. None of the planning scenarios would be in line with their net zero by 2050 vision. They all maintain existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and all but one involve increasing fossil fuel infrastructure into the future without acknowledging any of the risks or outcomes of climate change in the process. And then finally, we still believe that there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in how NorthWestern brings these plans together, how it approaches them collaboratively and takes the public's input, their advisory committee's inputs into account, rather than using the plan as a justification for decisions that really have already been made. So you might be wondering what's changed in the IRP. And largely, there's not any substantial changes from the draft to now. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is refreshing and getting into some of the details of it. And we kind of knew that NorthWestern was not inclined to redo any of its modeling. And that proved to be right when they did file the final IRP. So the modeling results are all unchanged. And a lot of the changes that we do see are slight adjustments to commentary throughout the plan, some minor corrections, and they added a few sections, some of which were helpful in response to critiques that were made, including, I think maybe the most notable thing they added was showing what would happen if they took away the constraints that they included for building out short and long duration storage, so effectively batteries. And they did show that the way they're modeling batteries, if they don't constrain them, the model will choose batteries for their entire need, which I think is telling of how valuable batteries are for our system. There is some truth to the fact that at some point you get diminishing value out of batteries, but it really goes to show that rather than just stopping their development, they really need to demonstrate through the modeling how that value interacts with more batteries on the system. And the only other thing I would say with the changes is kind of reading through what was changed in the IRP. It really, a lot of it feels somewhat defensive, and the adjustments and the responses to comments generally, instead of incorporating feedback, are just kind of defending what NorthWestern has already done, rather than actually improving. So I'm going to get a little bit into the modeling results, and I think it's important to kind of get a feel for what's the actual meat of the IRP without kind of getting too lost in all the graphs. I'm going to kind of walk us through, I think, some of the more important pieces here, just to get a feel for what we're actually talking about with the IRP. So I've mentioned that the plan is heavily reliant on coal and gas and nuclear energy. And this graphic I'm going to show here is a snapshot of all the different planning scenarios side by side, showing here on the left is the average amount of power that NorthWestern needs for all its customers on a given day throughout the year, next to its existing fossil fuel portfolio. So this doesn't even show existing hydropower, wind and solar contracts and the like. So for starters, we kind of see that there's a lot of fossil fuels, and actually more fossil fuels than the existing need. And into the future, in pretty much all of these scenarios, NorthWestern actually maintains those base fossil fuels and then adds more, largely in gas. And I also wanted to highlight that they treated part of their Colstrip plant really funny in this IRP. So at the beginning of this year, Northwestern acquired both Avista Energy's 222 megawatts of Colstrip and Puget Sound Energy's 370 megawatts. And while they are treating the one share as kind of a base assumption in all their planning, they only add in this other share when it seems to benefit them in the modeling, because they really didn't need all this extra coal power. But if we go to our data center scenarios, then of course they're saying, well, we have this power, so we have to, it's justified. But it makes it really hard to actually compare, especially the data center scenarios, to the rest of the plan. And then this graph just shows a reference of all the gas proposals that Northwestern is contemplating. So from an additional 250 megawatts in the base case to as much as 1,360 megawatts in the biggest data center scenario. And that is compared to the pretty substantial Yellowstone County Generating Station gas plant that they just built out in Laurel. So this is kind of the backdrop of what we're talking about in these possible futures for Northwestern. And this next one is just also nuclear, and Shannon's going to talk more about what we're looking at for the future of nuclear. But essentially, Northwestern is really relying heavily on this unproven technology somewhere down the road in most of its planning scenarios, and not capturing the costs of doing so. So now I want to just show kind of the different pieces that Northwestern breaks down in each of its scenarios without getting too into it. So for the base case, essentially how Northwestern has laid out the IRP, they show this forecast for their need into the future, which is that graph on the left. Based on the graph on the right, shows when they are losing existing resources. Like I mentioned earlier, if you look on the left, the top black line is actually the load forecast plus this, what they call the planning reserve margin, which is higher than it's ever been in the planning. And Northwestern really does a poor job justifying how they came up with that number, and that they actually need that big of a margin. So they're already kind of showing that they need this extra need on top of their forecast that hasn't fully been justified. And they're also representing that a lot of their existing contracts, Northwestern has a lot of contracts with wind and solar resources. And instead of extending any of those contracts, the plan assumes that when they expire, they need to replace it with something else. And then they go and build usually a gas plant to replace it. So we see here at the end of this year, their most productive wind resource, Judith Gap, is expiring, and they don't renew that. And I think it's really interesting if you look all the way ahead to, this is about 2040 in their planning, they say they're going to be 323 megawatts short. But like I mentioned earlier about transmission, they're gaining 300 megawatts of transmission capacity on the North Plains connector line. And then they have 39 megawatts of this wind facility that's going offline because they're not renewing the contract. And those two changes alone would be enough to meet their entire need, even though the need they projected is likely a lot higher than they would actually need it. And I'm going to go through these quickly, but for each of the scenarios, they kind of show a timeline of this is when we're going to build what resource. So in the base case, they have 250 megawatts of different kinds of gas plants, and then 640 megawatts of nuclear energy in SMRs. And they also have short and long duration gas storage, and they capped those at 250 megawatts of short duration storage and 150 megawatts of long duration storage. And in most of the scenarios, they have all of that storage in use because it is shown to be such a valuable part of a portfolio. And that's why they did constrain it. So one thing that is a positive out of this is it showed just how valuable storage is, but really there is probably a greater value than they're allowing to show through. And then finally, for each of their scenarios, they show the total cost over 20 years of that portfolio. So the base case they say is going to be $5.6 billion net present value is the net costs of that portfolio. And they also show emissions associated with those portfolios. And we're going to get back to these a little bit to talk about what they might mean. So the one set of planning outcomes I did want to touch on a little closer is the treatment of Colstrip, and specifically these three scenarios that Northwestern looks at early Colstrip retirement. And up front and center, you can see in the IRP in their executive summary, Northwestern says the modeling results confirm that early retirement to Colstrip is expensive to customers because replacing the capacity is major capital investments. And I want to show why that is so far from the truth, and really kind of serves to fill in Northwestern's decisions to acquire that resource and make money off of that resource, and not any result of actual lease cost of the portfolio. So here is those three scenarios where Colstrip would close early. There's one in 2029, 2031, and 2035. And those correspond to the EPA's requirements for mercury and air toxic standards and greenhouse gas rules, and when that plant would have had to close if it needed to comply with some of these standards at these certain dates. And as you can see, that when the plant retires early, Northwestern has opted to replace it with the most expensive kind of generation available. This is all gas and SMRs later on. There is a little bit of wind and solar in the 2031 closure scenario, but largely they're relying on gas. And then if you look at the base case, there is this major amount of nuclear. And I'm going to get back to that in a moment. So then if you look at the total cost for each of these portfolios, this is where Northwestern says, hey, look, we tried it. We tried to close Colstrip early, but it costs way too much. And these three different columns show, compared to the base case, it's 19% or 9% or 10% more expensive if we close in these different years. So we shouldn't do that. And then the other half of the equation there is, what about the costs that aren't reflected if you just capture the next 20 years? And this is what's really important, because Northwestern is only capturing if it builds a resource, it's going to amortize it over a certain number of years. And then each year customers have to pay for that until it is fully expired. So if we look at holistically, the 2029 closure scenario with the remaining costs that we're going to have to pay after that, you actually get a total of $7.5 billion for that portfolio. If you look at a 2031 closure, $7.4 billion, 2035 closure, $7.8 billion. But then if you look at Northwestern's supposedly cheapest scenario, their base case, it's actually $8 billion. And a large part of that is because, like I highlighted before, that nuclear resource, it comes in at the end of the planning horizon. So there's a lot of cost left because Northwestern has breaks that cost for nuclear specifically over 60 years. And if they build nuclear in 2043, this plan only looks at costs for the first 3 years to 2046. So looking at all these together, you see that actually there's a lot more to that statement that it's cheaper to retire Colstrip early. And then this last scenario is just looking at if Northwestern were to invest in the technology to bring the plant into compliance for safety of the emissions from that plant. And that's the most expensive of all. And this is all the cost of the portfolio, like I showed before, of replacing Colstrip with really expensive gas, primarily. Notably, this 2031 scenario is actually a little cheaper, and that was the scenario in the last slide that still had some amount of wind and solar, which I think contributes to the fact that that one is not is slightly less expensive than the rest. And the other point I want to make then is, so this is the total cost of replacing it based on those assumptions, but there's actually a lot of alternative ways we could go to replace Colstrip with clean and affordable energy. And this was a study by RMI from, I think it was January 2025, looking at how we could cost effectively transition Colstrip to specifically wind, solar, and batteries, and how that was going to be a cheaper outcome than continuing to run the plant. So there really are other options that aren't reflected from the IRP. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it off to Shannon.
Sweet. Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Shannon James, and I'm the Campaigns and Advocacy Director with MEIC. And we can move to the next slide. So, as Nick mentioned, NorthWestern is looking to replace Colstrip with nuclear power, which does remain the most expensive form of generation that we have available. But the reality of the costs are not accurately reflected, as Nick said, in the IRP because of that 20-year planning window. And so as a result, nuclear energy appears artificially inexpensive. And these cost estimates are even more uncertain because there are currently no commercial small modular reactors operating in the US. And so it's risky enough to base future resource planning on this unproven technology, but it's even more concerning with the current rapid deregulation of the nuclear industry. There's a lot happening right now on the federal level, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but it's important to know what is going on when NorthWestern is looking at developing nuclear in Montana. So last May, Trump signed a series of executive orders aimed at rapidly expanding nuclear power while weakening the independent oversight structure that Congress has had in place for more than 50 years when it split the Atomic Energy Commission into separate regulatory and promotional agencies, which is currently now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy. The overall goal of these executive orders is to quadruple US's nuclear capacity by 2050, adding in 300 gigawatts of new generation onto the grid. And these orders transfer a lot of authority away from our public safety regulators at the NRC and towards industry interests at the DOE. Next slide, please. So one of those orders directs the DOE to have at least 3 new reactors operating by the 4th of July of this year, which is an aggressive timeline that defies decades of experience with nuclear construction and safety oversight. So in order to meet this deadline, the DOE has been quietly slashing hundreds of pages of nuclear safety requirements. According to an NPR analysis, there were more than 750 pages of protections removed, leaving only about 1/3 of the original requirements in place. Some of the most concerning changes in there was the removal of the long-standing safety or radiation safety principle known as ALARA, or as low as reasonably achievable, which requires nuclear operators to keep levels of radiation exposure below the legal limit whenever possible. So removing this standard could allow reactors to be built with less shielding, increasing risks to workers and nearby communities. They also replaced detailed requirements for protecting water supplies and managing radioactive waste with vague language about simply avoiding contamination, and numerous other safety and security requirements were also eliminated. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the NRC is now following suit in a lot of these rule changes. Thankfully, they are at least required to provide public notice and often a comment period for their rule changes. So MEIC will continue to reach out and let you know when those opportunities for engagement are. Thankfully, commercially operating reactors will also still require licenses from the NRC, but they are doing everything they can to mandate expedited approvals, turning what was historically a watchdog agency into more of a lapdog and requiring them to rubber stamp industry profits over public safety. And this should raise concerns for an industry with such a dangerous track record, and one that Northwestern is working to promote because it will create the most executive and shareholder profits for their company. So we really need to urge Northwestern to prioritize energy resources that are safer, cheaper, and readily available today, which is AKA wind and solar. I think we all know that here. So the last thing I'll mention is that a lot of the current push for this nuclear revival is being driven by the growing demand from data centers, which Nick is going to get into next.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, so the last piece of kind of more detailed modeling results I wanted to review is how Northwestern is looking at potential data center demand growth. So I mentioned that the base case that Northwestern is looking at and that projection for increased need has kind of carved out this current situation we're in of data center demand growth, and they've set those aside in three separate sensitivities or scenarios. One that would involve 150 megawatts of demand growth from data centers. The other is 650 megawatts from data centers, and finally 1160 megawatts. And Northwestern established these thresholds as long as possibly a year ago, or I think it was the beginning of last summer. And they have said that these were meant to reflect what they knew about potential data center letters of intent at that time. But we do know that publicly Northwestern has 1,400 megawatts of data center letters of intent, as well as other undisclosed conversations with as many as I think 11 additional data centers that might want to come to Montana or South Dakota and be served by Northwestern. So each of these next slides is going to show these three scenarios, but we should note that the largest of these scenarios is still less than the total amount of load growth that Northwestern has publicly announced they're trying to pursue with data centers. So this graph is from the 1160 megawatt scenario, the largest data center scenario. And I just wanted to highlight that the majority of this load growth, Northwestern has used Colstrip, additional gas, and nuclear. So using all of the 814 megawatts of Colstrip that Northwestern owns, much of that we don't need under any non-data center demand growth scenario. Over 1,300 megawatts of gas and almost 1,000 megawatts of nuclear. Then you can see that there's storage filling in the pieces, and then just a little bit of solar at the end to round it off. So then this shows kind of these three data center scenarios side by side. And effectively what we're going to see is more data centers means more investment in infrastructure, means more costs on the system. So, and like I mentioned at the start of the call, since Northwestern is only adding its extra Colstrip in the data center scenarios, it's hard to fully compare these because there's actually extra coal baked into these planning futures than there is in many of the other planning futures. And this is all on top of the existing baseline portfolio that Northwestern has that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So we see that more data centers means they invest in more resources. That also means the total emissions of their portfolio goes up. So this is the 20-year total CO2 emissions for the base case versus each of the data center scenarios. And you'll notice that the largest scenario is a 96% increase to emissions over 20 years. So that means double the emissions we would have over the next 20 years with that data center demand growth. And that's because of that gas and because of the coal that Northwestern intends to serve data centers with. And of course, we would expect that with this increased need for power, it's going to cost a lot more. So in that highest data center growth scenario, the total portfolio costs 135% more than the base case. And in the IRP, there's some attempt to justify some of these costs based on the per unit of energy delivered cost, or the argument that if you have more customers utilizing the infrastructure at a higher rate, then the cost per customer could actually decrease. And there is some slim amount of truth to that, where if you can fully utilize the existing grid and infrastructure we have, you can get more out of it at a per unit cost. But like I said, that's a pretty slim truth to it. And that doesn't fix the problem of if you utilize a coal plant more, that's going to cause a lot more emissions. And what we do see is that whilst there's this pretty popular study that came out recently demonstrating this potential impact of increased load, increased demand, leading to a better utilized system and therefore lower costs. And what that shows is if you use the existing infrastructure more, maybe you can get this benefit. But when you have to go and build all this extra infrastructure, then that can be reversed. And some of the modeling results show that under the lower data center demand scenario, there might actually be that higher utilization. But when you get to the highest data center growth scenario, the per unit delivered energy cost is actually higher based on their modeling. And the last key piece of that is who actually pays. So the total cost of the system is one thing, but the other issue is that oftentimes these costs are shifted towards the residential customer class. So even if some of NorthWestern's customers do see a benefit, a lot of these big interests, the tech companies behind data centers, have the money and the lobbying power to persuade the allocation of those costs in a way that is not actually equitable and doesn't actually keep all the costs on the data centers. So that's a big concern that we have and is really important in the IRP, is also really important in a number of other venues. And MEIC has been very active on the data center front, as I'm sure many folks on this call are aware. And there's a complete dedicated docket at the Public Service Commission right now, trying to make sure that any costs that are incurred are siloed and fully allocated to those customers, the data centers. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it back to Katie to talk more about, now that we know about the IRP, let's get engaged.
Right. And before we do that, I'm just going to use this transition to pitch our event in Broadview next week, which we're now going to be streaming on Zoom. It's the site of the largest data center proposal in the state from Quantica, which could be more than 7,000 megawatts, which is 10 times as much energy as NorthWestern's customers currently use on average in a year. And so an enormous facility. When Nick's saying like those costs could be spread out amongst customers, a facility like that is definitely one that we're worried about. And so we'll be recording that presentation. Broadview's a far drive for a lot of folks, I'm sure, on this call. So if you can tune in, great. If not, we'll still record it and share it later. But that one is definitely an all play because it will impact everybody in the state. So important to participate where we can, such as with this IRP. And so I think it's really important too to talk about what can the PSC do. We can go to the next slide. Because when we're telling the PSC what our concerns are, knowing what they can actually do about it is really important. And so what the PSC should do is send the IRP back to NorthWestern Energy and tell them to do better. And in a few specific ways. They should actually take public input into account. They should fix their modeling configurations. So we heard from Nick about how they have a heavy bias against wind and solar and for gas, coal, and nuclear. Modeling exists without bias. You can do these things earnestly, and NorthWestern Energy should. That is what they're supposed to do, and the PSC should hold them accountable to that. Northwestern should consider the benefit of transmission, and especially interregional transmission, connecting our grid into the wider grid and establishing a better capacity need forecast. And so being able to more accurately see what energy is available on the grid, how Northwestern can plug into that more reasonably and accurately, can help save customers money. And they just don't give it a fair shake in this IRP. And it should also address Northwestern's contributions to climate change and the risks that climate change poses. We have a right to a clean and healthful environment in Montana, and Held v. Montana determined that includes a stable climate. And that is something the Northwestern Energy and the PSC should all be considering. And so as we talk about how to make your comments, these are things that you can ask the PSC to do. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll just again flash these comment opportunities onto the screen. Written comments can be collected until July 28th, so there's quite a bit of time until that. You could go to our event next week and incorporate that into your comments as well. All good things. And then, like I said, they haven't scheduled their public meetings yet, but we'll let you know when we know. I think it's at least 2. We think they should hold one in every PSC district, so everybody gets a chance to participate. So if you are able to participate in one of the in-person meetings, there's a couple of frameworks that I have available, and these are also on our website. So if you don't capture this during this call, I just put a link in the chat with this outline. So for 1 minute of testimony, you can prepare around 160 to 180 words and say, you know, my name is Katie Spence, S-P-E-N-C-E, and I live in Missoula, Montana. So, you know, say your name and where you live. Say why the issue being considered matters to you. The IRP matters to me because I live and work in Montana and I have to pay energy bills here, and I don't have a choice but to have Northwestern Energy as my utility. State your position and talk about a factual reason that you support or oppose the matter at hand. So I oppose this IRP because it didn't give fair consideration to renewable resources that are more affordable. It perpetuates the climate crisis in a way that endangers, you know, myself and my children, and other reasons that you feel you connect to. And then tell the deliberating body, the PSC, what you want them to do. So that's what we just went over about what the PSC can do. They can send it back to Northwestern Energy with some really specific outlines. And that will also help in future IRP processes because this is an iterative process. They have to do this every 3 years and they should be getting better. The fact that they are not getting better is something you could include in a comment. And then you end with a thanks. You know, if you're in person and they're right there, you can thank them for listening, taking concern seriously. I'm going to say that one's up to you. It is best practice, but follow your heart when you're there. If we go to the next slide, there's an example of if you have 3 minutes of testimony. It's very similar outline, but you get about 450 words, which is about a page of typed words. You want to expand a little bit more on your personal connection to the issue and your concern about impacts. And you can give more factual reasons for, you know, why this body should support or oppose. In this case, we oppose it, the issue at hand. And if you could go to the next slide. Written comments can be very similar. In general, if you've heard us talk about written comments before, we often say, you know, especially during the legislature, you know, people are busy, keep it really brief and short and to the point, straightforward. I think because there's a decently long comment period, and this is a high priority for the PSC, you don't have to be as brief as maybe we've suggested in the past. And especially if you have specific knowledge or experiences that are relevant to this process, do expand upon those and go into detail. If you're able to reference specific parts of the IRP, that's also great. And then there are other ways to speak up. You can write an op-ed to your local paper or a letter to the editor. I have some more information and thoughts and guidelines in that resources page I put in the chat. If you have questions or need help, our team is usually pretty responsive in trying to support when people are trying to get something in the paper. We love seeing you write into the paper. If you write something and get it published, send it to us. And we'd love to read it and share it if possible. Your local paper will usually have some word count guidelines. I do have some on our website, and if you see any that are wrong, let me know and I'll fix it. And then tell people. The most important thing is that people know that this is happening. A lot of us are captive ratepayers of NorthWestern Energy, and we don't get a choice. And so we have to speak up and advocate for ourselves because some of the entities that are meant to advocate for us aren't always doing that very well. And so chat with your neighbors, chat with your coworkers. This is a really important process and it impacts a lot of people. So I think that's the end of our prepared remarks and we can jump into Q&A.
Thanks, Katie. And I would add, just to cap off your discussion, one additional forum that folks can use is the Public Service Commission does meet every Tuesday, or at least most Tuesdays at 1:30 p.m. And you can call their office or email their office in advance to get a Zoom link. And they accept comments at the start of those meetings on matters relevant to the commission. So you don't have to wait for one of their public meetings, though you should definitely go to one of them if you can. But you can also keep bringing it to those meetings. And the last thing I wanted to say is, so I'm sure folks on this call were involved 3 years ago when the 2023 IRP came around, and there was, I believe, 5 meetings. A lot of people turned out. There's a lot of really good engagement. I think they said there is nearly 500 comments, which at the time might have been the most the commission had ever received for any matter. And those comments actually did have a real impact. They influenced the staff, especially at the commission, listened and took a lot of it into account as they recommended what the commission should do. And it really came through in the final review of the plan for a number of reasons that commenters time and time again pointed out that staff relayed, and a number of those did end up in the commission's final report. And the final point that's really important is there's kind of a long delayed process of how the IRP turns into NorthWestern going to build a resource that turns into NorthWestern trying to charge us for those resources. So this is kind of the start of that cycle. And I'm sure folks are familiar with the rate case that wrapped up recently that included the Yellowstone County Generating Station. The requests for reconsideration of that case haven't actually been fully addressed. So it's actually ongoing what the final result will be. But the concerns around the gas plant dated all the way back to the 2019 IRP, and a lot of the reasons why certain costs were eventually disallowed, we don't agree with how much NorthWestern still got to charge us for. But a lot of the reasons why part of it wasn't allowed went all the way back to issues with that planning document in 2019. So this is real. It impacts all those things along the way and will have influence over the energy future. So really hope that folks will turn out.
Thanks, Nick. We already have a handful of questions in the chat, so let's just jump in. Okay, from Caitlin, curious about the best example of pushback we've seen from the PSC during a past IRP process. Are you aware of a time the PSC has pushed back particularly hard in a previous process? And what's the gap between what they can legally do to push back and what they've been willing to do?
That's a good question. Thinking to the last process specifically, the commission did send back the IRP. They got the original IRP, and there is a lot of pieces missing, and it didn't come to be a full scrap of the document, but it resulted in NorthWestern had to file pages and pages of kind of addendum documents. And at the end, the commission and the staff pointed to that, saying, you guys really need to be more organized. We shouldn't have to go through this. And that was really strong. And there is, like I mentioned before, there were ways that specifically the model was not set up fairly. There were pieces back in 2019 of how NorthWestern set up its need that biased it towards that gas plant. And getting into the details of why the modeling is actually wrong and not I want this resource because it's what I believe in. Those should be taken seriously by the commission. They're not always, but if you really are pointing to these reasons why it's actually fundamentally flawed, those should be taken into consideration.
Great. All right. From Karen. Why does the IRP process not include damages like air pollution and climate change? Is there any other precedent in place where these societal costs have to be considered? Or any precedent in other places? My apologies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not super versed in every utility's IRPs. I'm pretty darn sure that these are things that are at least acknowledged in other plans. Um, and there's actually a requirement within our planning statutes in the law in Montana that Northwestern has to consider externalities, so societal externalities when creating the IRP. And climate change is just a prime example of that. So that's something you can point to is this isn't just something I want. This is something that you are required by law to include this externality, the social cost of greenhouse gases, these damages from climate change that I, as a Montanan and as a ratepayer, am facing. That's something in addition to our constitutional right to clean and healthful environment that really are required to be a part of this.
Right. From Gary. What are the chances of utilizing the Xcel Energy collaboration with Google to enable solar/LDES to power their data center as a model showing less cost than fossil fuel generation?
Thanks, Gary. I think that's a great thing to point to in comments saying that there's a way that some places are trying to do this. And Northwestern did model long duration energy storage. They did not model it with solar or wind. So that's a really important distinction because solar on its own is only going to provide power when the sun is shining. But if you have a 100-hour battery paired with solar, then any amount of power generated, you can use that power where it's needed. So I think that's a great example to show how they can do even better in their representation of long duration storage.
Thanks. We've got another. How can the IRP be handled simultaneously as the merger, yet they don't have to match?
That is a great question. We asked that. I was a member of the stakeholder advisory group with Northwestern, and when this merger came to light, we asked, what does this mean for this whole process? And they said, we're just going to make our plan and kind of put on the blinders. And when we get there, that's what we're going to see. So yeah, it feels like it should have an impact. They've really isolated it. If the merger does go through, Northwestern will be operating theoretically as a subsidiary. So they'll still be an entity in Montana, but they'll have these larger kind of motives in the bigger company that very well could impact the planning future.
David, I think that's really similar to your question, and I'll just underline what Nick said. This is why commenting is so important. These things are going to impact each other, and to consider them in a little bit of a vacuum, I understand the need for it, but also your comments can connect those dots, I think, in really important ways. All right, we have a few questions from Mark. First one is, does Northwestern Energy acknowledge the reality and effect of climate change and factor it into its analysis?
Yeah, this is extremely frustrating because Northwestern is required to respond to all the comments that are submitted, and some of those responses are more substantial than others. And if you look through the now 382-page document, climate change is mentioned once, and it's specifically in regard to summarizing some stakeholders' concern about climate change. So they did not address it. They did not factor in how it would affect its resources, the output of, say, prolonged drought on their existing hydro resources, or heat to lower the output of a thermal generating unit like a gas or a coal plant. So this is just completely missing. It needs to be in there. And it's pretty just kind of insulting that it hasn't been.
Agreed. I put in a link to the Facebook reel we posted today where you can hear me read Nick's summary of the most WTF moments, including that. It's extremely frustrating. So that might be a good summary too if you want to watch it before you write your comments. Next one from Mark. Why didn't NorthWestern Energy renew the Judith Gap wind contract? Is some other entity contracting for that resource in its stead?
Yeah, so the most we've heard from Northwestern is that they were outbid for that contract, and that was more something they told us more recently. This is something we've raised for the past really several years. That what are you going to do with this resource when it expires? And they kind of just dismissed those requests and concerns, and it's really frustrating. They haven't renewed it. Supposedly, someone else is going to be contracting for that resource, but it won't be benefiting Montana customers. It very well could be a data center, which would be really frustrating. And the way that they've set up their model, it just is not able to contemplate the idea of holding on to these contracts, which likely has something to do with the fact that Northwestern doesn't get a return on energy that it doesn't own. It gets its return on equity if it builds something.
Thanks, Nick. Our next one, also from Mark. Will excessive executive compensation be part of MEIC's or anyone else's critique of the IRP? And I just want to note that there's also some excessive executive compensation as part of a merger bonus that I'm going to put in the chat before Nick answers.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason you can't include that. We didn't include it, at least in our comments to Northwestern. We haven't made our comments to the PSC yet. This is something that I think comes up in the context of rate cases too, and other things. I don't know if it necessarily impacts the outcome of what resources they're going to select, other than showing that they are maximizing for profit and not for an affordable system. But I don't think there's any reason to not include that.
Especially since we're the ones paying for that. All right. I think that we have run out of questions. Does anybody else have questions? You're welcome to take yourselves off of mute or put in additional questions in the chat.
I'll add one. Yeah, just curious if you have thoughts on like there's a just any like enforcement mechanisms that beyond the regular processes for the PSC to compel Northwestern Energy or for other entities to compel Northwestern Energy to follow the law.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Northwestern has to meet some minimum filing requirements with the plan, and if we can at least point out if those haven't been met. I imagine there's an opportunity to challenge, like legally, if there's a specific statutory component of the planning rules that hasn't been met. But it is a tricky thing to enforce. And the first step is trying to get the PSC to do its job and kind of assessing from there if there's other avenues.
And I'll note that the legislature plays an important part in this as well. The legislature sets the rules for what kind of power the PSC can exercise. And so our next session starts in January and will run through May. And that'll be a really important time to usually play defense, but sometimes things can get fun and we can do some real good there as well. So stay tuned for that. We're already thinking about it.
Yeah. I think with that kind of takes us to the end of the hour here. Thanks everyone for joining and for tuning in. You can find more information, including our previous webinar, on our website, and we'll be sending out information as we learn it, specifically around these public meetings. So make sure you're subscribed to our action alerts and email list.